so much for being here again for our second edition of Soirée Historique à Maillardville. So tonight is a very special moment, as was the last one. The last one was First Nation 101, Autochtone 101. We start from the beginning. And now we're coming into our community. So an important family in this community, and a family also that has had a very important impact, as much financially, economically, than culturally and community-wise, and political. Of course, was the Proulx family. They were the first people to have the first post office. And why I think, and most people do think the same, as does Société des Postes Canada, Canada Post also, is that this project, when we first did the tent for the Proulx Family Bureau de Poste, was financed by Canada Post. And the reason why it was financed is that we could sell to them the idea that Maillardville would not have existed had we not had an official post office with a stamp Maillardville. So that was since 1913, so they were generous enough to make that whole initiative start. And then from there, the Proulx family found out that this was happening, and then a whole bunch of stuff has happened over the years. So we're very, very pleased that they're here tonight to share some family history.
Je m'appelle Nicole Itel Irene Proulx, and I'm the matriarch, which just means the oldest. I'd like to welcome Roberta and Faye, who have come from Kamloops and Vernon, a long way, but they're here tonight to represent the Proulx. And the purpose of this gathering is to share stories about the lives of our grandparents, George Hector Proulx and Fabiana Martineau. They settled in Maillardville in 1910 after coming from Quebec, looking for a better life. George and Fabiana left 22 grandchildren, so I have 22 first cousins. It's a lot. 22 grandchildren in 6 different families, so we have 6 different stories of each thing that was told. You know, each person heard a different story. Since getting together for the reunion in 2011, and we did have 100 and something people in 2011 up at the community center, we've been sharing stories and asking questions like, what did your mom say about this? And no, my dad didn't say that. It's been quite interesting. So we decided we wanted to share what we do know before it's lost, and leave it to our descendants. My son is here. He doesn't know half of this. None of us had the privilege of knowing our grandfather. He died at 53, a fairly young man, so none of us were born. He led an interesting but short life. We all knew that he'd been the Reeve of Coquitlam, and that he was the first to obtain a beer license in Maillardville, and the post office and the store, but we didn't know really very much about him. And only a handful of us knew our grandmother. I was lucky enough too. We called her Granny Proulx Godden, because after my grandfather died, she remarried Pop Godden, as we called him. So she was always, to my family anyway, Granny Proulx Godden. But to some of the other families, she was Grandma. We never called her Grandma. We called her Granny Proulx Godden. I knew her, but she was kind of a scary lady. She didn't talk to, I don't know if any of you ever talked to her. I don't remember ever.
She used to rock me on a rocking chair and sing to me in French. I remember that, but I was 2 or 3. I still remember that.
Yeah, she was very distant. And she was sick. She was not well. Anyway, I found her a very cold and scary person. But they were, my grandmother and grandfather, they were pioneers, and they thrived in this community. They did very well in this community. Today we're going to address some of the questions and share some of the new discoveries that we've heard, and make a little bit of speculation about what we don't know. It should be interesting. Before we get going, though, I want Louise, Lillian, Helen, Gloria, and Yvonne to stand up. These are the people that made this happen. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here tonight. So let's have a big round of applause for these people that made it happen. It was a labor of love, but it was a lot of work. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Louise, who will start telling stories.
A few years ago, some of us attended the Festival du Bois, where a tent was set up representing the Proulx General Store. And inside, we met our grandparents for the very first time, played by Roger Lubert and Joanne Plourde. I want to thank them for bringing out family stories from within us and raising more questions. Also, thanks to Joanne Dumas for facilitating this evening. Shannon's not here, but Shannon is my cousin Barbara's daughter, and she gave me excellent ideas of where I might find information. And Yvonne, your thorough research has, for our reunion and tonight, so thank you for that. Facts and, of course, some fiction will be presented tonight. We will follow a chronological timeline. However, feel free to interject and add anything you may know or think you know at any time. By the end of the evening, we hope to have a clearer picture of the lives of our pioneering grandparents, George Proulx and Fabiana Martineau. To start, the first slide on the screen there, it's the oldest picture we have of a Proulx family member. This is Felix Proulx and his wife, Marie Dineige Brossard. And Lillian's daughter happens to be named Dineige. So,
Stand up,
yeah. There she is. I didn't know she there. So it gets passed on. And so they married in Nicolet, Quebec. And they were in Stoke Centre. Okay, second slide. This is Elodie Baudouin and Amy Proulx, our great-grandparents, not great-grandparents. And Elodie was born in 1851, Amy in 1852. They married in 1877. On the census record, it says he is a cultivateur, a farmer. Then 1881, their son, George Hector Proulx, was born in Stoke Centre. Slide 3, please. Fabiana Martineau was born to Louis Martineau and Artemise Rodrigue in 1870. Not 100% sure that is Louis Martineau, but by 1911, Artemise was the sole head of the household, and she remarried in 1922. Looking at the clothing, it looks like it would be prior to the 1911 census. So I believe that's Louis with Artemise. And it was interesting finding them on the census record, because Martineau had been transcribed as Martinson, and Louis was written as Veris. So it was only by chance that, knowing where they were living, that I went through page after page to find the family. So anyways. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Fabiana, their daughter, and it looks like early, mid-19 to 1910-ish sort of time by the clothing again. Okay, and the next slide. This is a picture of Amy and Elodie Proulx. There are 9 of their children in there. They had a total of 10 children. There are some spouses in that picture and some grandchildren. And just a few weeks ago, it can go on to the next picture, just a few weeks ago, I contacted a descendant of the Duplans. Their 10th child, Denora, had already been married before that last picture, and she wasn't in it. And this Duplan here in Surrey, she sent me a picture of the 10th child that we had never seen before, Denora. So that's the woman in the picture there. So we don't have a picture of all 10 kids together, and I didn't Photoshop, so. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so picture of the store, and we'll go to Lillian.
I found it very interesting when I was reading about the family how we ended up coming to Maillardville in the first place. And Fraser Mills began in 1889, as many people may know here. The workers were mainly Chinese, East Indian, Japanese, some English. The higher management was kind of English. And however, there was a riot in 1907 in Bellingham there was lean time. The economy hasn't changed in 100 years. There's lean times, good times. So when it became lean, they were all, we need the jobs here, we don't want all this immigration. So there was a big riot. It transferred to Vancouver, and it was a 3-day riot with 10,000 people rioting on the streets. So then, as the lumber company changed hands, they decided that maybe they needed to get some Canadians. They didn't want to feed into this anti-immigration. So they decided to go back east with the help of some priests. And the priests, I think, they bought into this because they would be given a church, right? They would have a church, a congregation. So anyway, so they went back east to around Sherbrooke in a few places, and Stokes is very close to Sherbrooke, and that's how they came out. The first arrival of 100 people came in 1909, and it was called the honeymoon special on the train because everybody got married the night before, or a lot of people got married the night before and then came west, right? So our family came out in 1910. And we don't, because as you said, we don't know our grandparents and we didn't hear their stories. We do have a cousin? George's brother, Baudouin, married Ida Couture, if there's any Couture here, and she did write a little bit about traveling on the train. She was 9 years old, so I'll just read kind of what she said. She left Sherbrooke. The train stopped in many places, small towns. We could stock up, pork and beans, cheese. I believe we moved to the Fraser Mills yard. There was nothing but scrub brush here. I do not know what they call them, kind of like barracks. Every family had a part of the barrack, without rooms, nothing, just one room. There was a kitchen where meals were cooked. We stayed in the barracks until we had our little 4-room house in Fraser Mills. So that's kind of her impression, which she probably gathered from her mom, as it's saying, what is this, it's just bush. But there was no houses, no school, no sidewalks. There was a doctor at the mill, at the sawmill, and a nurse. No road, bears around the house, in the undergrowth. Many of the families were forced to share accommodations. So our family came in 1910, Amy Proulx, with the Chantran family and the Duplans, which turned out in the end to be relatives because they married. And we heard our family was well off and that they rented their own train car to get here. So that was kind of, at least from my mother, that was like, we were rich. So they rented their own train and came here, stayed on the train for a week, and then don't know sort of how the next part happened. But I guess we came at the end of May 1910, and then George was assigned contract number 19 because Fraser Mills would one of the promises was they would give you a 1/4 acre of land for $150. and you had to pay it back at $5 a month. So he was number 19, Block 5, Lot 14, and he received that on July 1st, 1910. So that was a few months after they arrived. But then, of course, they had to clear the land. Like, that was just the beginning of what you do when you have this land. Most of the goods in Fraser Mills had a company store, so most people bought goods at the company store, which, of course, if they had to do on credit, you know that whole story. You don't really ever get ahead because you owe the store and all that stuff. But they were promised, and the Fraser Mills did follow that up. They promised, they built a church by the end of 1910. There was a church for Christmas. They did get their land, a plot of land, and they were promised $2 per day, working 10 hours, 6 hours, or 6 days a week. So they did fulfill their promises in that way. He purchased the building from someone else that had been there for about 9 months. It wasn't complete when grandfather bought it. And then he opened, so it wasn't the company store, it was another store. The second store kind of in Maillardville. And they lived above the store. And it was right on Burnett and Laval.
Okay, according to the Canada Post records, the postmaster designation for the post office was September 1st, 1912. Then 1913 was a really eventful year for all the Proulx family and for Maillardville. The first thing I came across when I was researching it through newspapers was in June that year, there was a newspaper article that said Mr. and Mrs. George Proulx returned home. It said, Mr. and Mrs. George Proulx, Maillardville, arrived home from Montreal on Saturday and received a hearty welcome from their friends. Well, this is 1913, and they did not get married until 1917. So when I read that, I contacted Yvonne, who I knew had the marriage certificate, and I wanted to see that marriage certificate in person, and sure enough, they got married 1917 in Calgary. Yeah, we don't know why. So this newspaper article, I thought, well, what the heck? Did she come out here and were they pretending to be married, or what was going on? We had all these questions, and Lillian said, they couldn't have done that. Knowing my mother, they couldn't have done that. So
Your grandmother.
yeah. So anyways, it raised a lot of questions. And then it was a while later that I went back to looking through the newspapers. And sure enough, the next week's newspaper, I come across this article. Not Mr. and Mrs. George Proulx. Mr. and Mrs. Baudouin Proulx were entertained last night by a large gathering of friends on the occasion of their arrival from the East at the termination of their wedding trip. A very pleasant social evening enlivened by the music of the Proulx family, all talented musicians, was spent by Mr. and Mrs. Proulx, received the heartiest good wishes for their happiness and prosperity. So I'm thinking we had a...
It must be a scandal.
yeah, some misidentification there, not sure, but it was interesting to come across that. So the next thing, lacrosse was booming. The Maillardville Lacrosse Club is getting into good shape and practicing as assiduously as the weather will permit. George Proulx has secured the uniforms for the boys, and on Sunday a full dress parade and game will be held. The lads are making such progress that they contemplate challenging some of the neighboring junior teams to a match. And then the next slide, please. This is the Maillardville Band. And the newspaper article, July 26, said, at a meeting held in Maillardville on Wednesday evening in Chief of Police Perry's house, it was resolved to form a brass band of 14 instruments to be called the Maillardville Band. The following officers were elected. Honorary President, Reverend Father Garon. Honorary Vice President, Reeve Barth, Coquitlam. President, E. Perry. Secretary Treasurer, Joseph Choquette. Executive, A.E. Boileau, G. Proulx, and R. Lahoud. Arrangements have been made to purchase the necessary instruments and for practices. Most of the members are experienced performers. Now, I have no idea, and I don't know if any of us know what our grandfather played, and never heard a story about that, so we don't know. And so the next thing.
We did always have music at our get-togethers.
Yes, we always did, so don't know. Next slide, please. So the next event was September 21st, and the Postmaster General of Canada pays a visit to the Proulx. We had all seen this picture, and I think it's in the Lourdes batch of pictures. Yeah, it's there too. What it said at the bottom was Les Proulx AMEs and Père Garon. It didn't identify all these other people. So I ran across this newspaper article that helped me identify these people. We had no idea that the Postmaster General, and he's right in the middle of that picture, had come out to visit at Maillardville. And just bear with me, it's a long newspaper article, and I thought about condensing it, but it's very powerful, it's interesting. So here we go. It says, Postmaster General visits countrymen. Honorable L.P. Pelletier speaks in French to people from Old Quebec at gathering in Maillardville yesterday. Entire population listens to address. School children get holiday. Maillardville was in fête yesterday in honor of the visit of Postmaster General Honorable L.P. Pelletier. Flags from every house, Canadian flags, Union Jacks, and a sprinkling of tricolors gave the little town a coloring that caused the speeding motorists passing through to ask questions. One small boy asked what the occasion was and replied, "It is the minister, and we are to have a holiday next week," alluding to the most important fact in his estimation, that the Postmaster General had requested the Sisters of the École Notre-Dame de Lourdes to grant the pupils a holiday, a request, of course, immediately acceded to. The visit was quite unexpected. The people only received intimation that their distinguished countryman intended paying them a visit on Saturday evening, so the night before. The party. Besides the Postmaster General himself, the party consisted of Mrs. Pelletier, Mrs. Boileau, his niece, Colonel J.D. Taylor, MP, and Mrs. Taylor, Mr. Clements, MP, Comox Atlin, J.R. Greenfield, Post Office Inspector, and Mr. Burke, Secretary to Fraser Mills, Vancouver. On arrival at Maillardville, they were met and welcomed by Reeve and Mrs. Barth Coquitlam, Reverend Père Garon, Amy Proulx, G.H. Proulx, local postmaster, and A.E. Boileau. The whole party then proceeded to the residence of Amy Proulx, father of the postmaster, where they entertained to a capital luncheon. So that's their front porch there, and according to Perret's book, he had built quite a large house there. So, at the conclusion of the luncheon, Mr. Pelletier thanked Mr. Proulx for his hospitable entertainment and especially complimented the ladies on the nice way they had attended to the guests. The agreeable function finished, the party stepped out on the veranda, opposite which, in the street, nearly the whole population of the town had assembled. So here we are looking at them now. Yeah. This was the opportunity for the Maillardville Band, which here made its first public appearance. It played a suitable selection in excellent style. Reeve Barth introduced the Postmaster General in a few words in French. Mr. Pelletier, who was received with enthusiastic cheers, spoke in French. There was nothing political in his address. I question that. It was simply the friendly greetings of the French Canadian from Old Quebec to an assembly of his compatriots far distant from their old homes, and a revival of old memories. The minister congratulated them on their enterprise and vigor in creating such a fine settlement. in such a short space of time, 2 or 3 years, from what was then virgin forest, exhibiting the noble qualities of the first French pioneers. He sketched the history of Old Quebec during the last 3 centuries. The French pioneers had originally come from Normandy, Brittany, and Vendée, and proved they possessed the finest pioneering qualities from French domination, Canada, passed to English domination. They should not be sorry for that, because they had got that fair play which had always characterized British administration. They had got freedom in religion and liberty of language. He exhorted them always to and respect the British flag, and if necessity arose, to fight for it. But that duty was not incompatible with their own traditions. They should never forget their own ancestry, history, and language. He again congratulated them upon great development he saw around him, and pointed out with pride how they, by their own efforts, had built a church, a school, a convent, and so many splendid houses. He complimented the band on the success it had achieved, taking into consideration the fact that they had only been organized a few weeks. The Postmaster General's address was loudly cheered throughout. After the speech, the house party was photographed on the veranda. There they are. The honorable gentleman and his party then proceeded to the Convent School, and here met with delightful reception. As soon as the door opened, the organ played, and 9 of the smallest boys in the school stood up, each holding a large block letter in his hand, which together formed the word Bienvenue, while 7 of the older girls performed the same pleasant duty while holding up a letter representing the word in English, welcome. At the same time, 2 boys at the back of the hall held up a school banner. A pleasing incident was the presentation of a short address in French by little Miss Beatrice Duplan, a granddaughter of Mr. Proulx, that's Amy Proulx, which was as follows. At the news that the minister was coming to visit the blessed home where we received the benefit of instruction, very great was our joy, and from our hearts we declare, be welcome. In thanks for the honor that you are bestowing on us today, the pupils of Maillardville School shall pray the Lord to grant you every possible happiness, and to us pleasure of seeing you again. Little Miss Duplan conducted herself with great dignity while reading the address, bowing gravely at proper intervals, like a little queen, as Colonel Taylor observed. When the Postmaster General kissed her acknowledgement, the little one was delighted. 2 songs were also pleasingly sung, the first of welcome in English and O Canada in French. Mr. Pelletier addressed the children, said he was very pleased to see them looking so well. He enjoyed much of their entertainment, and especially the letters spelling welcome. He reminded them that the Reverend Sisters had come all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific to educate them, and from all that he could see, the education they were receiving was perfect, educating them to be good Christians. The education given them was in both French and English, which was well. They should be able to speak both. They should never forget their own language. He complimented the sisters upon the apparent results of their instruction, and asked that the children be granted a half day in remembrance of this day, a popular request which was readily granted. There are 115 children in the school, 36 of whom are English speaking, chiefly from the Fraser Mills. After visiting the classrooms and Père Guérin and taking leave of his hosts, the party left amidst the respectful salutations of the citizens. Subsequently, Colonel Taylor conducted Monsieur Pelletier and several gentlemen of the party in a motor car to the tall timber area on Yale Road, 20 square miles of virgin forest, which will soon be under the axe. The minister had expressed a keen desire to view this magnificent forest. So it was just very enlightening, and I was able to Google some of the people to see who was who in that picture. So learned a lot from that as to what was happening at the times.
Just a thought I want
Yep.
to share. The actual article that she's quoting the little girl, the newspaper actually is showing what she said in French. And
Yes.
that really impressed me. She read it in English, you read a translation.
Yes.
But the little girl literally, the newspaper translated and said exactly the words she used, en français. And I just caught that there just for a second to translate. But the fact that it was a major paper of the day, this was almost front page news, that impressed me. So there was an understanding of the importance of this visit, right, at many levels. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and my accent is so terrible, I didn't want to attempt it in French, so. Okay, so the next thing in 1913 was in December.
Churches destroyed and several burned in early morning fire. Just at a time when the residents of Maillardville were decorating their church for the Christmas festival, the fire fiend swooped down early this morning with disastrous results, the edifice being totally destroyed, while only the efforts of practically every able-bodied man in the settlement saved the convent and priest resident. At 3 o'clock this morning, all that remained of the church, which was erected 3 years ago, was a burning mass of timbers, while men could be seen on the housetops adjoining the conflagration, armed with pails and other utensils, preventing the shingles from breaking out afresh. Just how the fire originated was a mystery to the residents. Up to 11 o'clock last evening, the ladies of the parish had been decorating the building in preparation for the holding of the annual Christmas midnight mass. It is believed that an overheated stove started the blaze. Several burned. Father Guerin, the priest who resides adjoining the church, was the first to hear the fire. Father Guerin, along with others, will remember the fire from numerous burns on the hands and face caused by their entering the building in an effort to save the furniture. Chief of Police Proulx was the first on the ground, entering the burning belfry to warn the citizens. The alarm was answered with a will, and a strong body of men were soon on the ground. The convent was saved after almost superhuman efforts, the Sisters of Mercy leaving the building in the midst of extreme danger. The damage will amount to upwards of $10,000 to the church. An additional $1,000 damage was done to the priest's house, while the convent and also the home of Mr. Proulx was badly scorched. So that would be Amy Proulx.
That house there.
Ah, good to know. Thank you. So that was the story about the church.
So the next few years, even though George was running the store, we have him also some articles from BC Record that he was installing waterworks, laying pipe and that kind of thing. Come 1917, in April, Elodie, Amy's wife, passed away of heart disease. September 27th of 1917 is when George and Fabiana married in Calgary. And we don't know why. Do you have the article? You do?
No,
Okay.
I don't, but my understanding was that she was in Quebec and they decided to marry and she traveled out to Quebec. Not to Calgary, and he went up there to meet her.
Yeah.
Married in a church, and came down.
Yeah. It just seems unusual that they didn't come all the way to Maillardville to marry or whatever.
Or he didn't go all the way back there.
Or he didn't go back there, yeah.
It
So,
took a while to find her marriage certificate because with her accent, they copied her first name instead of Marie with Carrie.
yes. And there's so many spelling mistakes and things, yeah. And so, again, in the Tony Perry book, he refers to Fabiana as an accomplished elocutionist. And so we were quite impressed with that, and we don't really know. But Lillian,
I remember my mom talking about it was really poems and it was French. So, like you were saying, she was kind of a scary woman, and I think, well, she was probably very used to projecting and on stage because she was on stage. And I have another cousin who felt the same. She would always say, because she was English, c'est mon petit chou, and she didn't know what that meant. She thought it was scary. But I'm sure she had a booming voice because she was projecting. So she wasn't.
She was ill before we ever knew her.
Yeah. So we don't know why she waited so long. They were 36 and 31 when they got married, which seems like late in life in those days. But it could be because she was in a wealthy family that she had to be pretty darn sure that there was a good place to come. So we don't know the reasons, but okay, then it starts the years of consecutive births. So in 1918, it starts with Amy Sr. dying. So both Amy and Elodie have now passed away, and Amy Jr. is born. 1919, Lillian and Gloria's mother, Frances, was born. 1920, this is an article that I ran across by chance because they have Proulx misspelled in it, and I don't even know how I ran across it. But the title is, it's from the British Columbia Federationist, and I don't know if many of you know about that newspaper, but it says, "Will support union bakers. Mill workers refuse to purchase Shelley's bread." Mill workers employed at the Fraser Mills, who are members of the Lumber and Camp Workers Industrial Union of the One Big Union, and that's the title, took a decided stand on the question of assisting their fellow workers employed at the bakery business in securing union conditions. Want union bread. At the business meeting held in Maillardville, the members present, after passing a resolution requesting members to refrain from purchasing scab bread, elected a committee to get in touch with the local grocer, Monsieur Proulx, to inform him that unless he made arrangements to supply his customers with union bread, that members of this union would cease dealing at his store. Mr. Proulx agreed to do so, and there is no doubt that the action taken by these men made him realize that when the workers are organized and prepared to back up their demands, that he and his kind must comply with same. This illustrates in a small way what might be accomplished should workers organize on a class basis and decide to run things in their own interest. For the big business interests would then realize the same as Mr. Proulx, that is, it was safe and sane policy to pursue to agree to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So just looking at some of the articles in the newspaper, it was very much a communist newspaper, and it was all talking about what's happening in Russia and on and on. And just below this article, the headline was, "Newspapers, an Army of Prostitutes." So that was quite interesting, to say the least.
So we were the well-off, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So anyways, at this point, same year, 1920, Yvonne, this robbery.
Okay, this is August 1920. And let me set the scenario here. Maillardville was a relatively new community, although they'd been together for a few years now. But whenever something unusual happens, it's really big news. Now, the downtown core, there was a block where there were a few stores. There was the butcher shop, a liquor store, a pool room, a pet's general store, and down the street a bit further, about a block away, was the police house and the fire hall. This became known as the hub of Maillardville. The George Proulx store was also there, and it had the post office, so it was kind of important. It was a popular place to hang out. I mean, after all, there was no TV or internet, so the fellows had to do something. And George Proux's store was famous for having a couple of card tables. And it was the worst kept secret that they would all meet there and play poker night after night. On an evening, about 8 o'clock at night in August, and in August the sun stays up fairly late, so about 8 o'clock a taxi pulled up with a passenger to the Proulx store, and a man entered the store brandishing a gun to rob the store. Just at that time, George had gone upstairs to get some change, and on the way back he saw it. So he went back up and he called the police. Two big birdy guys come roaring down the street, and one went in the front door and one went in the back door. And meanwhile, they had got the men to unload their pockets. So they're taking out their pocket watches, they're taking out all their money. He was getting all their valuables. It was going to be quite the robbery. And in the store was George's brother Baudouin, because he helped run the store, and Paul Hatchie, Dan Amaro, Joe Girard, Maurice Tremblay, and Rene Vallier, all of whom had a few dollars each in their pockets, and a few had pocket watches. They were all laid out. And they robbed the cash register of almost $40. Now you may think $60 isn't much of a haul, but remember, most men worked at the mill for 10 hours a day at $2.50 a day. So that's a fair amount of money. The two big birdie policemen arrived, and while the gun was pointed at the police chief, his deputy came up from behind him and managed to grab him and put his finger in the finger lock there where the trigger is so that he couldn't pull the bullet. I find that amazing. They wrestled around, they managed to disarm him. The robber was found guilty and sent to jail. They don't know what happened to the taxi driver, but the story was rampant that men chased this taxi driver up the street shooting at him. So I guess as stories go along, they get more and more exciting.
Is that why we can't have any taxis come out for family?
That could be.
Started back then again.
Yeah. So this was big news because this was a small town, and that was a hold up a gunpoint. It's exciting.
Yeah. So, and then, okay, so after that, yes, there was another birth.
Yes. A few months later.
And that was, so there was a gap of a year, so no births in 1921, but 1922, Alice was born. 1923, next slide, George is elected mayor of Coquitlam, Reeve, as it was called. He was called in those days. So Lillian is now going to talk about the big event of that year. So we can go on to the next slide.
George was Reeve. He was invited. He had a formal invite to the President of the United States was coming to visit. So basically, it was a luncheon with President Harding at the ballroom in the Hotel Vancouver. And we have some pictures of the invitation, and then their fancy formal wear that they wore to the ball.
And here's the top hat.
Oh, and the top hat is here. Yes, yeah. So, and Grandma was a really good seamstress. She made a lot of the clothes, and we believe she made her dress. So, and she actually was a milliner too, so she might have made her hat as well. So,
she was making fascinators before they were in style.
yeah. So, President Harding began it was called the Voyage of Understanding, and he traveled across the central United States. Then he was doing a visit up to Alaska, the first time a president had been to Alaska, and then he was coming back down to Vancouver, and this was the first time a visiting president had ever come to Canada. So it was a very big deal. And they were hoping it would give him, he was not feeling well, it would give him a little chance to rest and boost his popularity by doing this Voyage of Understanding. So, so he was traveling up, he was coming down back from Alaska, and he was feeling worse and worse. The doctors thought it might have been ptomaine poisoning from crab meat, which is of course what you would eat coming from Alaska and down the coast. But once he arrived in Vancouver, he received a 21-gun salute along the dock. He inspected a guard of honor while a Canadian military band picked at the strains of Star Spangled Banner. He was greeted enthusiastically by a crowd of over 40,000 people, and there's the picture of the crowd, right? So they lined the streets for the 2 miles that he was driving through Stanley Park.
a stage was set up in Stanley Park, and in his speech he stated, "You are a very good neighbor, and we rejoice in your advancement and admire your independence no less sincerely than we value your friendship." So of course the crowds cheered, and they lined the streets and pressed into the hotel lobby, which was the Hotel Vancouver, to get a glimpse of him. So our grandfather was one of them, but there was 600 guests invited to the ballroom. So, but they did have they probably in the receiving line and had lunch with the president. So. The president left Vancouver at 10 o'clock that night, surrounded by a sea fog. So that sounds like Vancouver. And unfortunately, his condition worsened, and within a week, he passed away in San Francisco. So for those who are here, we do have a memorial, International Peace Memorial, which was dedicated in 1925 to President Harding, and it's on the spot that he gave his speech in Stanley Park. And there's a picture of it. It's quite a massive memorial. So next time you're in Stanley Park, have a look. So, yeah. Yeah.